But we're here tonight to hear from Jay Dyer. First of all, Jay, I think a lot of people think that you're like some kind of transgender weirdo because they pull up your website and they see that face.
I'm not Mila Jovovich.
But this is here's his website, and you can see it says he does film analysis. He also does geopolitics and espionage. He does philosophy, esoterica, and theos, which I guess is a cooler word for theology. But Jay, as you look at his stuff and as you read his stuff and listen to his podcast, is just a fabulous thinker. He's gifted, and he's able to deal with a whole lot of content and a whole lot of stuff. And as we all know, it's a crazy world out there. And how do you make sense of it? And first of all, you just have to make sense of it with some kind of logic and reason, which is hard enough. But I know most everybody in this room. I think everybody in this room is a Christian, and you got to sort through it with the eyes of Christ and a Christian worldview, which Jay has. So I have not really come across anybody anywhere who approaches all of reality comprehensively like Jay does, and so I'm quite impressed. I'm looking forward to having a chat with him tonight and asking him some questions. That's my purpose tonight, is just to introduce you, just get to know each other a little bit, and you guys can take it from there. So come on down, Jay, and let's I'll share a few more things with him. Jamie, go ahead and play that little 30-second clip. He in the last week or two, he had 30,000 people listen to one of his podcasts. This is the
one of them was me.
One of them was you. And so here's the 30.
That was actually just me and him clicking 30,000.
This is what his intro to his podcast sounds like.
This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the biggest films in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood.
So 30,000 people listened to his podcast recently. On this website, he's got about 800 or so very lengthy academic scholarly pieces that deal with scientism, scientific theory, philosophy, theology, and also film analysis. Of course, most of his hits come through the film analysis side. Pulled up a stat for this introduction to say that, according to one survey, most people have read one book in the last year, but they've watched 30 movies. So Jay is not only academically smart, but he's bright enough to know that if he's going to actually reach people, he's going to do film analysis. So that's where they all come through. His Christian journey is interesting. He raised Baptist, military kid, is that right?
Yes.
And then got into the kind of the Presbyterian thing. A lot of us here are Covenant College related. He went through the Bonson Seminary correspondence thing, which is, if you guys know what Reconstructionism or theonomy is, Reformed Theological Seminary, that's kind of the really hardcore Presbyterians who say, like, what the Bible says ought to be teaching us how to run government. So he did that for a little while, and then started reading Thomas Aquinas' The City of God, and that really took him on a long journey. Started asking professors lots of questions, and they got ticked off at him, and so he became a Catholic, and he did Catholicism for about 10 years, but then for various reasons had some struggles there, and he is now identifies himself with Eastern Orthodox, attends an Eastern Orthodox church on a regular basis, which is what I do these days. Those of you who know me know that. And so Jay's got a very interesting kind of Eastern Christian perspective that he uses as his prism for figuring out reality. So that's a little Christian bio on him, and I'm sure I left things out, but I've got 3 or 4 formal questions for him. And the first question is, we're going to talk about the question of Hollywood being behind the scenes a little different than we might think, in that much of Hollywood, how much of it, you can tell us, is it a majority, a large majority, is funded by the defense industry and by the intelligence networks. How long has that been going on? Go ahead and cue up the Argo clip. How long has that been going on? What's the relationship between stagecraft and statecraft? How long has that been going on? And tell us what we really need to know about what really happens behind the scenes with Hollywood. We're going to clip first, and then you can tell us. Go ahead.
Actions of Iran have shocked the civilized world. Our embassy has been seized and more than 60 American citizens continue to be held as hostages.
If we're going to go, then we need to go now. What happened?
6 of the hostages went out a back exit. Where are they?
The Canadian ambassador's house.
Got Revolutionary Guards going door to door. These people die. They die badly. White House wants the 6 of them out.
What we like for this are bicycles.
Deliver the 6 bikes, provide them with maps.
Or you could just send in training wheels and meet them at the border with Gatorade.
It's gonna take a miracle to get them out.
White man, what are we watching?
I got an idea.
They're a Canadian film crew for a science fiction movie.
I fly into Tehran. We all fly out together as a film crew.
I need you to help me make a fake movie.
So you want to come to Hollywood and act like a big shot without actually doing anything?
Yeah.
You'll fit right in. You need a script?
Argo, science fantasy adventure. Moonscape, Mars, desert.
We need an exotic location to shoot.
You need a producer.
If I'm doing a fake movie, it's gonna be a fake hit.
You don't have a better bad idea than this?
This is the best bad idea we have, sir. By far. You have 72 hours to get them out.
They're getting a visitor.
You gotten people out this way before?
No. You're asking us to trust you with our lives.
This is what I do, and I've never left anyone behind.
I know who they are and they know they're hiding out.
It's over, Tony.
If they stay here, they will be taken out. Probably not alive. We're responsible for these people. I'm responsible. You really believe your little story is going to make a difference when there's a gun to our heads?
I think my little story is the only thing between you and a gun to your head.
All right, lights up. So, go ahead. Tell us what the world's all about in 3 minutes.
Based on Argo, or?
We got to start somewhere.
Okay, well, that's a good place to start. So I think the first thing I would say about that is that probably most people would assume that the Central Intelligence Agency exists to protect America from foreign threats. And so what you saw was an example of what's supposed to be a story that related to the Iranian Revolution. And the problem with that, I would say, is that, first of all, I don't think that the Central Intelligence Agency exists to protect America from foreign invaders. So there's a little bit of history that's involved in understanding why that might be. But if you go back to where the intelligence agencies arise from, it actually comes out of drug networks. Okay, so if you go back to the British Empire was built through what's called the Silk Road. It's sort of a drug pipeline, and so this allowed for the empire to traffic not just with its colonies, mercantilism and so forth, but also allowed for drugs. So I think everybody might know about the Opium Wars and how the British attacked China covertly through sending opium to China. So in other words, these networks where the drugs would be trafficked is where you get the rise of intelligence agencies in the modern world. So they also tie in very heavily to Wall Street. Wall Street is, in many senses, a flip side of the Central Intelligence Agency. So a lot of the people who would go into the founding of America's intelligence network, which would be the OSS in 1942, these would be people who come out of that world. They come out of the military intelligence world, they come out of banking, they come out of British intelligence, and they come out of drug trafficking. So the first thing I would say is that's what the intelligence agencies actually do. Now you have people who do office jobs, who are analysts, who probably are very patriotic and do good things, right? So this is not just to cast a broad blanket and be unfair to people, but rather that when you're dealing with large-scale geopolitics, which is what this film is trying to tell us about, you're not going to be presented, in my view, what the real story is. And we probably don't know what the real story is. Now, what about Argo? Well, Argo is a story based on a guy's book, a guy named Antonio Mendez, and he's the CIA's master of disguise. So when he wrote Master of Disguise, he was actually talking about all of the stagecraft that he would be involved in during the Cold War period. And so Iran factors into the Cold War era because the Iranian Revolution was supposed to be this anti-American hostage crisis that allowed the Ayatollahs to come to power, right? And so we were told at the time that the Ayatollahs hated Reagan, who at the time it was Carter, but then when Reagan would come into power, it was this warfare between this Shia Islam and the U.S. But what was actually going on, and this is according to people who formerly worked in naval intelligence, is that this was a ruse. So that's a difficult place to start with Argo, because Argo is a ruse about a ruse. So it's very layered. But if you read, there's a book called Devil's Game by Robert Dreyfuss, who's a famous journalist, and he wrote a really good breakdown of this situation with Argo. And what he argues is that that was actually sort of theater and stagecraft that was organized by the dominant power structure in the U.S. and has been the dominant power structure for several decades, which is oftentimes labeled under the title neoconservative. So the neoconservatives actually put this on to make Carter look bad, right? So this is called the October Surprise. And we were under the impression, again, in the 80s, you mentioned the Navy. My dad was in the Navy in the 80s and actually went to the Gulf in around 85 or 6 and was ordered to shoot down an oil platform. So he was on a naval ship and they shot down an oil platform. So I remember that vividly with him telling the stories. But the irony of all this is that Iran-Contra, if anybody remembers this, showed that the mainstream story of what was going on in America in the 80s about the Ayatollahs hating the U.S. is completely not true. And so you had these high-level generals and neoconservatives, General Secord and so forth, who were actually shipping weapons to the Iranians. And so this revolution that's what allowed the Ayatollahs to come to power. And so I'm not saying by that there's absolutely no opposition between the U.S. and Iran. For many people on the ground, so to speak, there would be. But in actual fact, you had the U.S. and particularly a private intelligence network that was known as Team B, or the Enterprise Network, which was part of the people involved in the Iran-Contra scandals in the 80s, like Oliver North and so forth. They were actually arming and helping these radicals. So a lot of times what we see presented in the mainstream media is actually theater, just like the movies are theater. And sometimes movie theater is actually multi-level meta theater, because as you saw in the storyline, or the auspices under which Ben Affleck sends people over is to create a fake movie, but they're actually there to help these, hostages. But
raise your hand if you've seen Argo. Okay.
No, and Argo won, right? Argo won the award that year for Best Film. So that had a tremendous effect on sort of reinforcing narratives that were created and written in the 80s, I believe. And then probably when that came out, I think there was a lot of strife with Ahmadinejad and Rouhani, or whoever it was that took over after Ahmadinejad. But point being is that sometimes they'll replay these things like the Argo story to rehash old tensions, so to speak.
I'm a little slow sometimes, so let me just ask. So what would be, if the funding for this movie was partly brought in by defense and intelligence, what is their agenda? What are they trying to accomplish in 2016 regarding a storyline that was
with
1979?
Iran? Well, I don't at all claim to be any kind of expert on Iran. Like I said, I've read a few books on Iran, but that by no means makes me an expert. So I can't say for sure that I know what all the geopolitical agendas would be. Other than that, there is a kind of loose opposition to the West on the part of nations like Syria, Iran, and Russia. And so these are seen by the West openly to be potential threats, not terrorist threats, in my opinion, my view, but as powerful, as potential leaders of opposition in the future. So it's not that Russia and Syria or Iran actually fund terror. I don't believe that they do, but they might be in the future a political or economic force of opposition. And so what agencies like the CIA actually do is topple anything or destabilize any kind of government or nation that might potentially produce a threat down the road.
So the agenda was to continue to provide a perception of Iran that's negative.
Exactly, and to also hype up tension and to possibly, but cast a negative view. That's how propaganda works.
I want to bring this back home a little bit here for filmmakers. Many of us here are, have a dream. Some people are even closer than others in this room of, getting feature films funded and, whatever. How pervasive is this funding mechanism in Hollywood, and how should it or does it need to factor into some people in this room who want to try to find funding for a feature movie?
Well, I would say on the part of the government apparatus, it would be tremendous. So you're going to, I don't know about you in your different situations, but when it comes to persons producing films, oftentimes they are offered stipends or extra funding from either NGOs or private institutions, private corporations, to interject certain messages or to twist things in a certain way, and you might get help, you might get aid, and that might come in different forms. It might come through money, it might come through the use of tanks and so forth for your film or whatever. But I mean, money is the main way that propaganda functions that the establishment functions to control messages put into popular films.
Would you say this funding relationship between defense and Hollywood is in most movies, a few movies, just the blockbusters?
I would say that generally speaking, it's usually the blockbusters. And so what can also happen is that people who are filmmakers who might catch on to this down the road as they start to make a few films and figure out how things really work. So you might make a film, maybe George Clooney kind of likes it. People figure out George Clooney might actually have the ability to pull some strings, and so you might be in touch with someone who, we're going to need to change the script to do X, Y, Z. So that's how it works, and it's not always government. It could be private entities that have an interest in the film, depending on what the film's about. So sometimes films, but I think that you have to reach a certain level of prominence before you would be literally auditioning yourself for government funding or big scale corporate funding. So I guess it just depends on what, because there's a lot, there's it's not all literally completely one entity. I mean, there can be other power blocks or people who have an interest in a certain message. I mean, this film probably wasn't just the CIA. There were probably other interests that, like business interests, that might have a certain goal for that region, and a film that targets Iran or presents Iran in a certain way could have monetary effects that would benefit a certain company.
Let me drive it into another direction with a filmmaker that people would be able to relate to here. I'm not going to show it, but I was going to show it just because of time, but a minute or two long clip from Christopher Nolan's a documentary about making The Prestige.
Mm-hmm.
And in that 1 minute clip, he talks about how being a filmmaker is much like being a magician. You're fooling the audience, and you're doing a lot of sleight of hand and that sort of thing. But tell us how what you're talking about might relate to Christopher Nolan, some of the strange things in his movies, and do you know anything about his funding and relationship with government entities?
It's funny, people always ask me about Christopher Nolan. I don't really know that much about Christopher Nolan other than that I think he's a decent filmmaker as modern filmmakers go. You know, there's, well, I have my favorites, obviously, but Christopher Nolan can make an interesting movie, and I think a lot of what comes out of Hollywood is so cookie cutter that is generally not very interesting. But as for him, I don't know what his funding mechanism is or what his individual goals are. I don't really try to pinpoint specific directors and completely expose them or something like that, other than when I come across examples in my research, such as Kubrick. I mean, Vivian Kubrick claims that Stanley was working directly with the CIA, and we know that he was intimately connected with NASA and Arthur C. Clarke and Mueller, who was the administrator for NASA at that time. And part of the deal was he could use the, I believe it's the Zeiss lens at that time, 50, yeah. He could use that lens if he was willing to go along with whatever goals the Pentagon had for his films. So they were very interested in his films because they were so, at that time, realistic. You know, nobody had seen anything of that stature. So he was allowed to look at different NASA and Air Force projects to help with his films, Dr. Strangelove or 2001. But I would mention as a side note, there is an academic book that's been written on this, and this is David Robb's book, Operation Hollywood: How the Pentagon Shapes and Censors Movies. And so there's plenty of examples, and a lot of films that you wouldn't necessarily expect actually have Pentagon funding and alterations done to the script. Now, there are other people who deal with the subject matter that I deal with who will point to this book, but I actually go much further than what a lot of those guys would say, because I don't think that it's just the Pentagon and the Army who have liaison offices, and the CIA actually thinks it goes a lot deeper, because a lot of people in Hollywood are members of secret societies, they're members of cults and so forth, and that cult structure will actually play into the power structure as well, even beyond things like just Department of Defense funding for your film.
Okay, we're going to get to that.
Yeah, I know we'll get to that.
And I'm going to shift to the next question in a second. But first, has anybody got any questions that are sort of on this topic before I move us along? Let's go to the third question, Jamie, the predictive programming one. There's some strange things in Hollywood that have to do with the occult and having to do with, he talked about it, the secret societies and that sort of thing. Start with the short clip from Iron Man. This is about a 15-minute clip. This is a 1994 Iron Man clip. And this is going to support those like Jay who say that there are people on the inside who know what's going to happen in the future because they're evil, and they put glimpses of it in media so that when it actually happens, people are sort of ready for it and anesthetized to it. Go ahead and play this one.
Simpsons.
That's
Unidentified warplane sighted heading for New York City.
Our detection system shows stopping. Mayday! Mayday! New York is under attack! Intercept and destroy!
A force field is shielding the warplane. It's getting through.
This next part is in the same episode.
Extremely difficult, but it's time. We will now strike at the heart of American defense and destroy the Pentagon with one swift and deadly blow.
All right, and then go ahead and show the next one, Jamie. Play it from 1 to 4.
Worst actor
a female underage in a motel by the Dallas Police Department on September 11, 1960?
Okay, you can stop it there. Okay, you can bring up the lights. Okay, what's that? I could have shown you a little bit longer. There's a long shots of all sorts of evil eye pyramids and compasses all throughout the Simpsons and cartoons, and I think the Grammy stage was an entire Illuminati eye this year if you looked at it. Well, we've just completely launched into another area, which is kind of crazy and wild. I'm almost wanting to let them ask questions first because it's beyond belief, and not with you because I know you believe some of the stuff. So before he starts talking, does anybody just want to say, are you crazy? Give me some better evidence of this, or go ahead.
Well, one caveat, I was a little iffy about that video just because I think there's some of those are relevant. Some of those I think are a little bit happenstance and coincidental. I don't necessarily build any sort of huge case off of merely those kinds of things. But there are so many examples of this. I was actually just sent I think it's a Newsweek cover from the 70s, and it's David Rockefeller discussing the plots of land that are going to be built where the World Trade Center is going to be built. And on the cover of Newsweek, you can see David Rockefeller sitting there talking, and it's about the World Trade Towers, and his watch is on 9/11. So there are so many of these that I think pile up over time that it's very hard to dismiss them as merely coincidental. There's just so many. And on top of that, one of the best is, of course, the episode of The Lone Gunman, which aired actually several months before 9/11. And that is the pilot of The Lone Gunman, which is a spin-off series from the X-Files. And if you watch that pilot, the jets are actually commandeered via radio and taken over and flown into the trade towers.
Jen, you can get the light off his head. Just take the website site down or something.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
Where I would get stuck with that kind of stuff is how does the logistics of that work, as far as how aware are all these writers and creators and people in all these different fields? Is there someone sending them throughout all these years messages and being like, all right, make sure his watch is at this time and make sure this is
Well, like I said, I would totally agree with you that some of these are happenstance, they're coincidental, but some of them are so precise that I don't see how it could be chalked up to coincidence. So sometimes I think that artists are just sort of doing things that they're inspired to do. I don't at all believe that there's one entity that has complete power over, that they can just script everything. But let me give you an example. So if you watch the film Wag the Dog, which is from the 90s, and it actually deals with the very topic that we're discussing. So there have been movies made about this very thing. The CIA, the characters played by Robert De Niro, they come to a producer in Hollywood and they say, we want you to script a war. And we're going to make a fake war in Albania. We're going to have Willie Nelson sing a theme song for it. It's going to be, we guard our American borders. It's like We Are the World, right? They have T-shirts. It's marketed. And not only that, that film actually includes the president at that time, and this is back in 92 or 3, undergoing a sex scandal involving a page or something to that effect. Now that was prior to Bill Clinton having his big time sex scandal. Now, again, if it was just an instance like that, I would say, maybe there's just a coincidence. But there's so many of these, if you research this topic, that when you start to consider the possibility of, well, the Pentagon, the CIA, they have their fingers so deeply into Hollywood that it starts to not be coincidence. So, you'd have to, I could list more of these, but in the situation of The Lone Gunman, for example, Dean Haglund, who was one of the stars of The Lone Gunman, gave an interview about 10 years ago on the radio where he said, yeah, actually when I was on the set for the X-Files, we would have people from the CIA come and they would alter the script and say, oh, you're going to put this in the script now. So if you look at the cases, and again, I'm not backing up every single example from The Simpsons or The Family Guy, but there's so many of them that I would venture to say that that's what's going on. That's the most logical explanation. They don't have a crystal ball. They don't have magic powers.
Sure.
But that's the most logical explanation in my mind. And that we have all of these instances of it being admitted, being open. I mean, for example, J.J. Abrams, when he was doing Alias before he became widely known, openly was working with the CIA on Alias. They were consulting. And so this happens a lot of times in film. You'll have people who work in intelligence who then go to consult in film. And so I've written a lot of articles. I've actually interviewed former spies who consulted on shows. Annie Michonne was a former British intelligence agent. She consulted on the BBC show Spooks. Or no, it's either it was Spooks or MI5. I don't remember. I interviewed her years ago. But in the academic world, people have written entire books on this. So Tricia Jenkins has a book, The CIA in Hollywood, and so she talks at length about the consultation between J.J. Abrams and the CIA. And then interestingly too, Jennifer Garner went on to work for the CIA after Alias, openly. So she went into doing PR and recruiting. So what we start to see is that Central Intelligence Agency is not so much interested in foreign threats as they are culture management, culture control, as well as management of black markets and all kinds of things. So it's a very...
To what end?
Well, I would say if you read the books of Zbigniew Brzezinski, he was the former Secretary of Foreign... he worked under Carter, sort of the background consultant to Carter. If you read Brzezinski's books, he talks about that the purpose is control. If you're going to run the world, which the American Atlanticist empire does, you need to control black markets as well as legitimate markets. And that's the whole point. So you need people who know what's going on to manage the black markets just like people manage legitimate markets.
Go ahead, Johnny.
Yeah, just to clarify who's doing it and the motive. So if the CIA is doing it, they put these hints and gremlins in The Simpsons about 9/11. Why? To warn people? I mean, what's the goal? If the CIA is doing that, are they doing that to say we're going to blow up the World Trade Center? Like, what's the end game there?
No, this is actually a philosophical,
okay.
It's a social engineering technique. Okay, so I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen the old 40s film Gaslight. It's a really good movie. You should go check it out. It's a non-Hitchcock movie from the 40s. And if you watch that movie, you'll see that what the guy does is that he finds this widowed, wealthy woman, and he wants her money. So what he does is he basically runs all these mind games on her, and she, by the end of the film, is so frazzled and bumfuddled that she is almost at the point of basically just giving up all the money to the trickster guy that she married. So that's from there, psychology has derived the term gaslighting, where you can kind of, like I might come steal your pen and be like, "Don't do that. I didn't steal your pen. Why would you think?" And I'm holding your pen. Why would you think I'd steal your pen? While I'm holding your pen, right? So that would be an example of gaslighting. If you look
I'd be like, "You're crazy."
You would.
You're holding my pen.
You would, but there's a lot of people who, if you implement this over time, this has an effect on people.
Okay.
So telling people what you're going to do or hinting that you're going to do something before you do it is a way to condition people. And so in military strategy or in social engineering, you have this idea of desensitizing, conditioning, or warming people up to something before it actually comes. And there's all kinds of ways that you can do this. And so if you look at advertising and marketing, a lot of the techniques that are used in those fields are used in intelligence operations. So I'm not saying that I know for sure that the CIA individually has placed every one of these instances in films.
Sure.
I don't know that, and I don't know that it's possible to know that. But what I'm saying is that I know that from the research that I've done that I think comes from credible sources, I can see how this strategy is done and how it It's been done for a long time, and it's a military strategy. For example, you could go back to, everybody's heard of Machiavelli in the Art of War, or the Prince, right?
Sure.
Well, he has another book called Art of War, which he named it after Sun Tzu's famous book, Art of War. And in book 6 of Machiavelli's Art of War, he says, let me tell you, dear fellow princes, how to run all these tricks and scams on people. And it's going to work in warfare, and you can do all these tricks and do this. And the machinations are just kind of mind-boggling.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that if you look at the history of military strategy and warfare, it's always about deception. All right, Sun Tzu says that the main way to win a war is through the mind. You don't really want to lose your troops. You just want to convince people that you're the good guy.
Sure.
So that's why warfare and psyops is marketing and strategy, right? So the two worlds mesh. And so what I'm saying is that what's going on with a lot of these examples is, and I believe that the way the mind works is that it records everything. Even if we don't have it in our conscious mind at all times,
sure,
it's been stored there because we saw it at one time. And I think this is just my opinion on how the mind works from my research. And so what happens is the Pentagon knows, the CIA knows that people are going to be watching, as you said, far more movies than they will reading than books will have been read, right? So they're much more concerned with the message that's presented in film. And there's all kinds of, it's a science. I mean, I don't know how to, it's so out there in terms of the advanced technology that can be involved in this kind of stuff that it would blow your mind. For example, I was reading a few articles about a year ago from IO9 or Gizmodo, one of these big clickbaity sites, that was discussing the absolute scientific specifications that have been determined for action sequences to make sure that the eye is drawn to a certain part of the screen at a certain point in the explosion to create a certain heart rate and bodily reaction, right? That affects, because I think humans are psychosomatic, right?
Of course.
Right. So it's that precise.
So they get excited at the right time during a film,
and,
which is where an explosion.
But exactly. And then sometimes if it's subliminal messaging, then that would be a time to put it in, because you've been excited and the rational faculty has been shut off, and so you're much more receptive to an emotional response and then reaction.
Cue up the Lucy clip. This is a huge thing, and we're going to come back to it. I'm not going to leave you guys hanging, but we've just bit off a huge enchilada. I'm going to show another clip that's going to talk about actually a larger agenda than just programming people for 9/11 and having to go, using that to go fight a bunch of Middle Eastern countries as our excuse. This is going to be about transhumanism and scientism. I'm going to go ahead and play that Lucy clip, and then we'll discuss that. We're going to come back to this. I'm going to let everybody ask their questions, but
what happened? What did you do to my stomach? What's going on?
You've nearly slipped new package into your lower tummy, and you're going to transport something very special to us.
No.
You speak English?
Yes.
Take me to the hospital now.
Hospital.
Somebody put a bag of drugs inside me. I need you to take it out. It's leaking.
It is estimated that most human beings only use 10% of the brain's capacity. Imagine if we could access 100%. Interesting things begin to happen. Yes?
Professor Norman, my name's Lucy. I just read all your research on the human brain. It's a little rudimentary, but you're on the right track.
Thank you.
I have access to 28% of my cerebral capacity. I can feel every living thing.
Since when did you start writing Chinese?
Since an hour ago.
What happens when she reaches 100%? I have no idea. all this knowledge, you can unlock secrets that go beyond our universe. I'm not even sure that mankind is ready for it.
It's like all things that make me human are fading away.
Okay. Stop that for us. The name Lucy is interesting. You might get to that, but talk the next question. And you can come back and tie it into the previous question whenever you want. But the elites have a different religion than we do. What religion is it? And do they believe in the supernatural? If they do, why do they try to tell us through scientism that there is no supernatural? And where does this group that has a different religion, where are they trying to take us?
I would also add that once upon a time, Luc Besson made good movies, and that's not one of them. La Femme de Kia is a good movie. But, well, so to answer your question, I would say that there are wealthy, powerful people who have different views, and some of them believe in the occult, and some of them are atheists. For example, I've read a good bit about David Rockefeller, but I don't have any evidence that he believes in anything occultic. I would say he's most likely just an atheist. But I think there are other people who do believe in the supernatural, and they believe in some notion of what's called Luciferianism, and this would be the idea that there is the potential to achieve godhood through natural or technological means apart from any sort of traditional religious notion. So they take the person of Lucifer or Satan from Scripture, and they see him as a kind of hero figure, a kind of Prometheus, and that the best explanation for how man can achieve godhood would be to utilize technology, or transhumanism as it's called, to eventually modify himself to where he can download himself into a computer, and you'll be in a zip drive, and then you'll live on forever. So that is the transhumanist mythology, is the idea that through advanced computing, quantum computing, and so forth, man will be able to achieve immortality through technological means. And I think that most of the tech elite are very into this. They think it's a very hip, trendy thing to believe in. And I think that the pop culture for a long time has really been propelling us in that direction. That's why you've seen so many films. That one's a great example, because in that film it's tied directly to the notion of Darwinism and evolution. And so it stands to reason from that perspective that since man has evolved from apes, supposedly, now we have the ability to do things like use the internet. It just stands to reason that we will transcend that at one point, and we will be outside of the bounds and limitations of time and space. So in other words, you have what in Christian theology is called theosis, is taken out of a Christian context and put into a natural context where deification or achieving immortality is done through natural means. And these natural means generally come out of the schools of secret societies, or what's called Hermeticism. And so traditional Western alchemy has always sought for this kind of a philosopher's stone, or this secret path to immortality through technology.
Questions from the floor?
I have a question. You may have heard of a philosopher/scientist, John Dee, back in the 1900s. Do you think it kind of maybe started with that, where they're combining this science and this technology, because he was known for his weird experiments and being, occultish, back then?
Right, so you have the Elizabethan spy, who's the first 007. His name's Dr. John Dee. And this is where 007, James Bond, gets his number from. It actually goes back to the Elizabethan spy. He was also the court magus and astrologer. And if you read his writings, he does talk about the possibility of, through alchemy and through different mystic practices and the angelic language, he believed that he deciphered, that you could find the secrets to immortality, so a kind of fountain of youth. But that idea of finding a fountain of youth in the West even goes back further than John Dee. You could look to, there were Renaissance thinkers who were also into Hermeticism and alchemy, and they thought that you could do the same thing. And ultimately, I think it's just kind of an ancient notion of mythology, right? You go back to Greek mythology and the idea of achieving immortality through some sort of special magical means.
Do you think?
Absolutely.
Do you think this religious worldview is kind of controlling where things are today, or do you think there's some kind of decent fight going on between Christian ethic and this Luciferian ethic?
I think that it's, in terms of the dominant power structure in the world, yes, it would be Luciferian. It's the term transhumanism is coined by the Huxleys, and so if you know about Aldous Huxley, if you've read Brave New World, this is a person who was involved in the British imperial power structure. He was part of the Fabian Royal Society and so forth, and he saw evolution as a spiritual thing. He saw it as something that would lead to, as we said, transhumanism and the ability to transcend our limitations through technology and so forth. And so he saw it literally in a mystical way, and he would definitely be classed as a Luciferian. So I would say that because the philosophy of the globalist and the Western global power structure is absolutely 100% that of the Huxleys and the United Nations and that whole entity. It was the Huxleys who also founded UNESCO, so they were very much involved in the United Nations. That's 100% their philosophy, and yes, it is absolutely 100% going forward, and that's why you see the promotion of, I don't know if the Ray Kurzweil thing is going to be played or not, but you know, this is what Google's into, this is what Facebook's all about. Also, all the big tech companies are right in line with this philosophy. This is what Microsoft exists to do.
Is there a connection between the discussion we're having right now and the previous question dealing with predictive programming on 9/11 and that sort of thing? Is the 9/11 event somehow related to the larger transhumanist agenda?
Yes, there is a great book that touches on this. I would recommend to people who kind of want a introduction to that, and it's kind of a classic in the alt conspiracy fringe world, but it's a really good book. It's very insightful. It's called Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare by Michael Hoffman. So he has written an entire book on the very thing that we're talking about. Also my book, so you definitely want to get my book. It can be pre-ordered now. It deals with this topic as well. And so so if we think about those Twin Towers, they're big symbols of commerce and trade and Western prowess. And so the destruction of those towers has a lot of significance, especially for Americans or people on the East Coast, right? They're very symbolic. And the destruction of those towers is, I believe, very much tied to the esoteric notions of a new aeon or a new age. And so from the Hermetic or Luciferian perspective, because we've reached the point where computers can do things like come close to human calculations of the brain through playing chess and AI and so forth, then that signals to us what's called the Deus Ex Machina, right? The God from within the system that's emerging. And so because we're in that time period, from their perspective, this signifies a new aeon, a new period. This is an older ancient Hindu notion of actually using astrology and planetary alignments to have these vast eras, or what the Hindus called yugas, right? So in the Hindu scheme, this is the Kali Yuga, which is the inversion of everything that's normal and natural. So you have servants becoming masters, you have women becoming men, you have everything topsy-turvy, children ruling parents, and that scheme is seen as something that will exist for thousands of years, right? So they're aeons, as they're called, long periods of time. So for a lot of these occultists and these types, they try to mimic that, and they come up with these long charts and tables of how, we've entered the new aeon now. This is the end of the Christian era. That was the last 2,000 years, signified by the age of the Pisces, and now we're moving into the age of Aquarius, which is very popular, the 60s counterculture that did the age of Aquarius. That's actually based on Hermetic and occultic writings like Crowley. He talked about that this would be the new era, and it is absolutely tied to transhumanism and the idea that through gnosis and through knowledge and techne, that man can achieve a completely new evolutionary status.
Are there occult numbers and signs associated with 9/11?
Absolutely. I mean, the 911. First, we obviously think about if you're in distress, you call 911. So that immediately has even if we're logically sitting here thinking, well, I'm not interested in calling 911 just because the towers fell. It has a subconscious effect on us because of association. And if you read about psychological operations or covert operations, you will see that that is a technique that's used. Association doesn't have to be logical. It can just be two things together on a page. So, for example, in the 70s, I think the CIA was involved in operations in Latin America, and what they would do is they would, if there was a dictator that they wanted to portray in a bad light or a good light, they would place his image on the page right next to something like a cross, right? So the mind is going to associate these two images together even if they're not logically connected in the flow of the article. But it works on a subconscious level, and that's a very specific scientific technique.
Okay. It's very interesting. I got a little... Can you talk about the secrecy of it and the whole division from like the elite to kind of the popular consciousness, and why not be a little bit more open about like why do the Luciferians need to kind of be doing all this in secret, and why not kind of help really openly introduce us meaning not the elite, into this new age? Is that just a power thing, or is that because they we're so comfortable they don't want people to freak out? Or
I would argue that actually part of what's contained in the new age, the new aeon, the new era, is the revealing. So it's what one famous occultist named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky called the externalization of the hierarchy, and this is where she thought that the time was coming where now it all could be laid out. And so when you see the UN promoting everything that it promotes, UNESCO promoting everything that it promotes, the Pentagon promoting what it does, all of this stuff that we talk about here, the stuff that's in the books, this is
the Grammys, the Olympic ceremonies,
all of these grand mega rituals, as I would say.
It's almost like one day they'll be able to see, like, look, we were trying to slowly show you, and you can now have a paper trail of how intentional all this.
Yeah, and it also gives you street cred, kind of like, like it's like if you think about this, how we think of serial killers leaving their clues and their trails, and then they're wanting to see who can figure out and who they can outsmart. Yeah.
Can you explain using to poison the meta with these ideas of like ritualistic magic, and like how to take a meme and to poison the meta to affect the medium, like our the psychic medium in general of what we're talking about. So you take a meme, you poison the meta, and for like a propaganda purpose. And this is the same as ritualistic magic, from someone in Saudi Daisy who's sacrificing a cat to liturgical black magic like seen in Stanley Kubrick. So I think that would make a segue connecting predictive programming to why is it on the Simpsons?
So for a long time, persons who might have fringe views or be into the occult, this was very, very much outlawed, right? So it was not legal to practice witchcraft or to practice whatever occultic thing you were into, especially in Europe, right? And so it would have to go underground. So these groups needed a way to communicate to one another. And so this is where you have the history of the interplay between secret societies and intelligence networks. So why would there be a connection between these two? Well, they both traffic in secrets. They both include secret members, right? And so the history of what's called cryptography, which is where, if you know about computers, you know about encryption, right? So if the history of cryptography is this principle of encoding things in different symbolic forms, be it numerical or be it symbols, whatever, to speak to the people who are in the know. So for example, you mentioned John Dee. When he signed 007, he would write 00 and then 7 over the zeros. This was specifically to Queen Elizabeth. And she knew that when she saw that, it was John Dee who wrote the letter and not some other spy, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that 007, by the way, is also quasi-Masonic because it's 2 balls and a cane, which is Tubal Cain, which comes out of very basic.
Yes.
It's phallic, but so anyway, so you have this history of cryptography and ciphers, which goes back to the ancient world. The Greeks were very adept at this. The Romans, there's a Caesar cipher. And then in the modern world, very much a part of the of Freemasonry. And so it's a world that's all kind of bound together in the trafficking of secrets. So for that group, oftentimes there's the perspective of, as you were talking about, how there might be a connection between ritual. Well, if we think about the ancient world and the priest, in some pagan religion, sort of sacrificing an animal, and then he knows when the eclipse is coming, and he says, "Give me all your firstborn," and we kill them on this day, and there will be an eclipse. And so, but he knows from the calendar when an eclipse is coming, right? But what that does is that has an effect upon the people, that they believe that this person has this power. He sacrificed an animal, and that led to the eclipse, right? Or the humans or the kids, right? But all it was that he had foreknowledge of the event, right? But it has an effect upon the audience. And so in that sense, that ritual magic is stagecraft and trickery, although it actually involved human sacrifice, at least for like Aztecs and Incas, right? So in the same way, what you can achieve through things like predictive programming is to give the impression that you're godlike when you're actually not. Right. So, for example, I mentioned to you Brzezinski's books. If you look at Brzezinski's books, he talks about weather warfare in the 1970s. And now this is like a top government official talking about weather warfare. And so it's only now that, at least in the alternative media or somewhat of the popular perspective, there's this idea that you can maybe manipulate the weather, perhaps. But he knew about it back then. So what does that say once you start to learn about that? Well, it gives you the, whoa. They must be like, God, they have these powers. They knew about this back in the 70s, right? How did Isaac Asimov talk about the internet in the 1940s in his novels, right? But it's not. They're not gods. It's just a trick. And that's how stagecraft, factors into this.
Wait, it's a trick because they knew it was going to happen?
Well, it's because they have knowledge of the technology.
Okay.
Right.
So the internet came out in the 1990s, but the government was actually using it in the 60s and 70s.
Exactly, right. And there were thinkers like Asimov who
had
foresaw that there would be, probably not magically, but he just looked ahead and said, "Oh, I can see how they would do that."
Mesh.
Do you think they're consulting demonic powers to get this information, or?
My perspective on that is that you have in the tradition of Hermeticism and alchemy certain truths about nature that are encoded into rituals and symbols and so forth, and that there are truths in those things that you can decipher, that you can mimic in technology. So in a sense, yes, in the sense of, I think that if you look at the biblical narrative, the rites and mysteries of the different pagan religions throughout the world come from, in some sense, fallen angelic forces, right? And so that's why you can have, for example, Leibniz back in the 1600s, he was a German philosopher, co-founder of calculus. He talked about the possibility of creating a logic machine that worked on its own as a mirror of the human mind. And he was at least somewhat of a student of these kinds of hermetic and alchemical mysteries. Now, I don't think that Leibniz was looking into a crystal ball, but he was smart enough to understand that through these different traditions, you could possibly derive some underlying current or language, or what he called the characteristica universalis, which is a universal language of logic, which would actually be formative for computers. So in a certain sense, I would liken it to the same way that humans can be illumined or enlightened by God or inspired. It's not like God is necessarily like immediately giving me visions. Oh man, God could do that, right? But generally that's not how that happens. It's through providence and through different means that we are enlightened. And I would say that there's a dark version of that as well. Now, as to how a person might actually contact the demonic, I would say that one way you could do that is the way that shamans have always done that, and that's through hallucinogenic drugs. So if you've ever had or known people that have had bad LSD experiences, and if you participated in maybe, and actually some people who are into that dark stuff, they will do hallucinogenic drugs and do ritual magic, and that is a means by which you can tap into those realms. And just for I've not seen people do that, but I'm saying I once had a bad trip, and I could see how people could see that could go down that road, and that's what a lot of people who are into the occult talk about. That Tim Leary, who actually worked for the CIA and promoted LSD, Leary has a whole book on contacting the dead and so forth through LSD. So that's one way by which they might do that. But I guess that depends on what your whole philosophy of LSD and what you think's going on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I appreciate that you are allowing a little, how you said there's a little bit of happenstance with what we saw and whatnot. And I also appreciate that you're citing some of your references and whatnot. I have a couple questions. One is, I'm interested in what your trigger was to why you started pursuing kind of the broader scope of this in film, and how there's signs and whatnot. Like, what's the first thing you saw that you thought, oh, you know what, I'm more interested in that, and I wanna follow that. And then my second follow-up question to that is, where are you taking this? What's your purpose in continuing this strain of thought and pursuing this knowledge? Like, what's your end goal with this? Are you just relaying information to the general populace? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Those are my two questions.
I want to be downloaded to a zip drive like Scarlett Johansson. I'm joking.
That's what I thought, so I thought I'd just...
Let's see, the first thing that I saw, well, I've always loved film, so I used to do stand-up, I used to do acting, I was like very involved in theater and all that, and so I enjoyed the whole idea of what acting and theater is, and play. And if you study that in depth, you'll learn about the history of it. And one of the things that stands out in the history of acting and theater is that it goes back to the rights of the gods, right? So if you go back to ancient Greek philosophy of plays, so to speak, which Plato actually talks about quite a bit, there's a whole dialogue called Ion of Plato's, where Plato and Socrates give their thesis on what's going on when people are inspired. So whether it's a musician playing an instrument or whether it's an actor who sort of takes on another spirit, they have this elaborate theory of how it was actually, you're actually tapping into the spirit in some mystical way. So that was common in the ancient world for the philosophy of theater. And so when I was studying theater and philosophy, that stuck out to me. And then I started thinking about it, as I've always loved film even since I was a kid. So you're watching movies and you start thinking, well, what's going on here? And then and I'm not saying that like every actor is possessed or anything like that, but you start to notice that film itself is a symbolic form. It's a symbolic medium, right? I mean, it's not the real thing. It's just a symbol on a screen. So you're dealing with symbols, and if you study philosophy, the philosophy of signs and symbols is called semiotics. It's a very elaborate discipline in philosophy. So it just seemed natural to go from semiotics, acting, theater, philosophy, to then looking at all of these other elements that all connect and tie in.
So would you say it was more of a process then, and less of like we're all sitting here and we see a video like that, we're presented with something like that, and it's supposed to be meant as like a trigger for thought, right? So was your life your trigger? Were you just like, I've kind of been led into this strain of thought and I'm going to keep pursuing it? Or was there something you read or something you watched that you were like, oh?
Probably not one thing, but yeah, like a whole series of things. Okay. I mean, the Bible obviously was very influential throughout my life. Moving into philosophy, apologetics, all of those arenas would inform my approach to, all of this kind of stuff. And if you like film, and I studied film quite a bit in undergrad, okay. It all melds together. I mean,
I think the question she might be asking, maybe you can't answer it, is at some point along the line did something trigger you to say, I'm starting to wonder if like all the powers that are like running like the media and the world and politics are like
in a like conspiracy sense.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That is my question.
Well, I would say when I started really diving into the Bible, there's the devil, right? And he's against God, and there's people who are on his side. So are the people who are on his side, all all unknowingly on his side, or are there actually some people who are knowingly on his
So
side.
you were just looking for the opposing force.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there would be certain books and documentaries that I saw along the way. So documentaries dealing with 9/11, Alex Jones's stuff, that kind of stuff all stuck out to me 12 years ago, 10 years ago. But yeah, I would recommend. This is a really good book that had a pretty big impact on me more recently, and it's called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and the author is Dave McGowan, and his work focuses on the history of the counterculture. So you have all of this music and art and so forth that comes out of the 60s, and why does it just spring up? And McGowan's thesis is that there was actually social engineering involved in the the sexual revolution that you talked about. Like all of that as a whole was seen to be a means to socially engineer society. And so he presents a really good thesis in there that I think he deals a lot with the music industry, but it also applies to film as well. So that's a good one. Jamie back there wrote an excellent book called Hollywood Mind Control. And so she has an entire book that is very well researched. She's done very good with this. She did her own artwork and stuff. So that's a good one. And I'm not just trying to sell books or something. Nobody's told me to sell these. I always anticipate skeptics. So I'm always trying to say, well, here you go, read this. Right?
Her second question, and then we'll get to you, Jeff. Thank you for deferring. Her second question is a really good one. We've heard a bunch of stuff that's been laid out on you guys. I told you at the beginning, I'm just here to introduce you because there's no way we can get into all of it. But she does ask really good questions like, okay, it's kind of like I asked Anthony, is it just all about despair, the meaning of your movie at the end? Or so it's all run by a Luciferian elite. Okay, so what? Now what do we do?
Well, number one, I don't think that everything is run by a Luciferian elite. I think when you're talking about big blockbusters that are going to be seen by potentially 1 billion people, and you're dealing with billions of dollars, there's no way that that's going to be left to chance, or that powerful oligarchs are not going to have their fingers in it. But there are plenty of independent filmmakers. I've seen tons of independent films that I thought were excellent, that had great messages, and I think a lot of people are doing genuinely anti-establishment art that is traditional. It supports a tradition. So one of the sites that I write for is Soul of the East, and my buddy Mark is a Russian thinker and philosopher, and so he's actually quite often citing Russian writers, philosophers, and so on. I'm not just saying that Russia is automatically good. I'm saying he's oftentimes pointing to quality material from Russia that we don't even know about or hear about, that he translates into English. And so you've got, it's a big world out there. There's plenty of people who, could potentially, you could do anything. So it's not about despair. And another reason that I talk about this stuff is that you'll start to notice that a lot of what you see in the news that's meant to be depressing and psychologically traumatic, a lot of that is baloney. It's made up. I'm not saying everything, but I'm saying a lot of it. And I make that argument, I make that case. And so once you start to see that the techniques of stagecraft, like we saw in Argo, are being used in news and media, you're a lot less traumatized or worried about these kinds of events. So it's actually an empowering thing, I would say.
Jeff, you've been very patient.
Lots of thoughts. So my first question is, it sounds like you're saying that the CIA planned the 9/11 attack.
I believe that there were numerous persons within the power structure. Most particularly, you could look at what's called the Project for a New American Century, and this would be a lot of the higher level neoconservatives, they're called. Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, they all got together 6 months prior to 9/11, and they wrote a policy book it's called a white paper, for the government to take America in a neoconservative direction. And in that document, they explicitly say, we need a large catalyzing event like Pearl Harbor to occur to reinvigorate and remilitarize the United States. Now, that's one example amongst a bunch that I think absolutely point to not just the CIA, but more so private contracting intelligence and private networks that would have actually been involved in that, directly working under powerful neoconservatives and moneyed oligarchs. And so I'm not going to say I have, here's a document that shows exactly who did what on 9/11. But there are so many indicators, not just because of film instances, but actual documentation and white papers that point in that direction. Another example would be, you can go back to the 60s, what's called Operation Northwoods. And this was drawn up by the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that time, L.L. Lemnitzer. Now, Lemnitzer was formerly the supreme head of Allied powers of NATO. Then he was working in the JFK government, and he drew up this document with that he presented to JFK and said, hey, why don't we run what's called a false flag on Cuba, and we're going to blow up a jet, right, and say that the Cubans did it. We'll have actors come on the TV and say that their family members died. We'll run fake news stories to provoke America into some operation against Cuba, presumably what would be the Bay of Pigs. Now, if that sounds far-fetched, just look at the history of military tactics and warfare. What's called a false flag is an ancient tactic. It's 100% known. It's been used for centuries. So nothing new there in terms of doing something bad and blaming it on your enemy, right? Now, you can look at, there's a famous book called Tragedy and Hope, and this was written by Dr. Carroll Quigley, who was the archivist for the Council on Foreign Relations. So the Council on Foreign Relations is one of these powerful supra-governmental bodies of mainly media-type persons, and what they do is craft and determine policy, particularly how it's spun in the media, for the West. This was started by David Rockefeller and others, and if you look at his archiving of the history of the CFR, this was a book that reportedly at least was given out to section chiefs of the CIA in the 70s because they were curious, why are we sometimes funding communists? I thought this was the Cold War. Well, Quigley's 1,000-page book actually explains it. So this is a person from the establishment who writes this 1,000-page book defending the practice of aiding and doing these things, right? Now, so he actually, in that book, not only does he discuss the fraudulent monetary system as a tactic of the elite, but he discusses the prevalent use of false flags. So you can go all the way back to the Lusitania in World War I, all the way up to the Gulf of Tonkin, and these are famous instances of staging an attack to motivate and mobilize public opinion for a war.
And the purpose so that the rich get wealthy? For what purpose?
Well, there's the famous statement from General Smedley Butler, 4-star general from the U.S., that war is a racket. So in one sense, yes, war does benefit private security contractors and so forth. But I mean, I don't think that money is the only reason that people go to war. There could be multiple reasons why. But if you're talking about World War I and II, Quigley says in his book, and again, this is a person who's pro-establishment. He was Bill Clinton's mentor, so he's not a conspiracy writer, but he wrote this big treatise that says we need to do this for the good of America, for the good of the West, for democracy, right? This is why we do these things like Argo, right? It's ultimately for the good because America, but that's all baloney. It's not good for America.
Yeah, just following up on that, this Anthony Sutton fellow, I don't remember if I read from your side, but I looked into this, how Wall Street funded the Bolsheviks, and he was from Stanford, and he got kicked out of Stanford after I think he wrote this book, but you look into his footnotes and it's like bomb-proof. I mean, he's citing like State Department documents. It's not
another famous professor.
This wild
absolutely
stuff, and I think that sort of thing, I'm still sort of grappling with how even to look at the world, because if something like that's true, then it actually indicates that a lot of stuff is a lie, basically.
Amen.
Okay, going back to the Luciferian thing, so when this word that you're using, Luciferian, I mean, you're saying, I mean, there's almost like maybe a hard and a soft Luciferian, because transhumanism, a lot of Western society is building towards this overcoming the human condition through technology, and the transhumanists just sort of make a virtue out of it, basically. So not necessarily a need to posit this, eyes wide shut kind of anti-church scene or something.
Well, I would. That's what I was trying to say. That for a lot of people involved in the tech elite, Apple, Google, and so forth, they may not see it as quote Luciferian. But I'm saying that there's certain thinkers who do speak of it that way. So you can look at somebody like Jacques Fresco, who's very involved in the UN. He sees it in this Masonic Auguste Comte type sense, where we're moving towards a city that's run by a central AI control grid, right?
There's a prayer room in the United Nations that's was put together there by the Lucis Trust. I think there's a plaque outside that says Lucis Trust, LUCIS. Back in about 1920, it was the Lucifer Trust. This Madame Blavatsky that he cited was kind of behind all that. But there's a Luciferian. We worship and follow a different God than what's talked than the Yahweh God in the Scripture. It's been around for a long time, and it's here.
There's
It's
like
real.
a room where they go worship.
Yeah, it's a meditation room in the United Nations.
Can you explain the difference then between like Satanism versus Luciferianism? One's more the dialectics of I'm controlling good and bad towards my goal versus the devil's going to give me power for whatever.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. There's people have different views, right? So some people think that they are Gnostics, and they think that transhumanism is a means by which man can transcend the limitations of creation, because time and space and creation are evil, right? That's the ancient Gnostic view, generally speaking. So then some of them might actually believe in the power of the dark side, that you could actually, for example, sacrifice a human and that this would give you energy or charge you. Aleister Crowley actually talks about that. He talks about the possibility of a sacrifice in his book Magic Theory and Practice. He talks about eating a heart, and that this ancient idea from voodoo that you take in that person's power, he believes that there was something to that. So some people do follow that. They do believe in those practices. There are people who practice cannibalism. Now, does that mean that everybody who's in the so-called elite is doing that? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there are high-level people who believe in the dark side and who believe in the occult, and that's not always overlapping, but it does have some overlap with people who believe that technology is the means by which we can transcend our human limitations. It's a very real philosophy, and if you look at Ray Kurzweil, who is one of the more popular theorists of this, that's how he sees it. He sees it as a means to achieving immortality. Now, I don't think that that's actually going to happen. So I'm not saying that. I think a lot of it's social engineering and deception. But a lot of people buy into this. They think that in fact, I don't know if you know about the Bilderberg group, but at last year's Bilderberg, this was what they were talking about. The person who used to run DARPA, her name's Regina Dugan. She now heads up Google, and she was at Bilderberg talking about bodily modification and tech, like melding with the body and taking implantable chips and vitamins that have RFID chips and so forth. I'm not trying to be a fearmonger because I think a lot of this is ridiculous. Because you start to see that what Ray Kurzweil talks about is very similar to Lucy. So, in other words, the fiction and the Hollywood is being promoted to you, and that's what's being sold, right? And then there are a lot of people that think that this is going to happen, like technology is going to make us immortal or eternal, as if David Rockefeller or any of these elites are going to give that to you, right? I mean, they're going to keep if that ever happened, they would be kept to themselves. It's not going to happen for you.
Okay. We've got a couple more questions. Go ahead, Jay.
I have to think of how to ask this, but one thing I've been kind of wondering about, and I know we're in a room with a lot of creatives, but I'm an artist, and I've actually spent a great deal of time with a kind of deep familiarity and involvement with a lot of the artistic elite in New York City, and there's a lot of transhumanist thought going through there, and a lot of the occult being practiced that
Sure.
I've had firsthand experience seeing, like witnessing. But one thing that I wanted to ask you about was because being an artist, I also have like a deep love for counterculture and for also practicing like creative practices that that do seem to maybe even channel
inspiration.
Yeah,
sure.
inspiration, and
I get that. Yeah,
and something that might even seem to be new. Something that did not exist before that, or on some level, like metaphysical level. And I'm just wondering, like, where for you, because especially the like creative fields that so many of us are involved in, where does using technology at all become like different than applying transhumanist practices, and then where does maybe like why necessarily do so many of these things and views have to be separate from what might be like a Christian traditional way practice or like way of life?
Well, good question. I don't think any the philosophy of the theology that I hold to, that I think is taught in Scripture, is that nothing is inherently evil in itself, right? So I'm saying that most of what's being presented to you is just an ideology to try to convince you of some other way by which the establishment can provide you with how to be happy and live your life. And they can't. So I say more power to you. I mean, absolutely, there's nothing wrong with any of the technology in itself. I mean, I think that as for an individual, so like if somebody wanted to, I've seen articles, I don't even know if these are true, but people like remove a finger and then have a robot finger put on to make a statement. I would see that as self-mutilation. I think that's ridiculous and retarded. I don't know why you'd want to do that. But, I think that's different than the idea of technology. I guess it just depends on the case. I mean, there could be cases where virtual reality could be helpful. It could be useful in hypothetical situations, but I mean, would you want to stay in that role for a long period of time? I don't think so. It would be harmful to you. But yes, I think that traditional thought and philosophy and theology is 100% compatible with technology and utilizing technology to promote your creative powers. But I guess it just takes wisdom in each individual case to know, when something is.
I'm gonna try to wind us
dangerous.
down, Johnny, and then Kevin.
I'm just wondering about like pop culture phenomena, because if we're talking about films that come out, like Lucy or whatever, the Gremlins or whatever, that's great, but what about Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings? I mean, these to me, even Harry Potter, seem to be extremely popular, and they seem to reinforce a line of thinking that is very much sort of mythic or mythic and even Christian in a lot of ways. That comes down to a hero that defeats darkness, the chosen one, if you will. Like, why are those? If those things are so popular, are we being, fed something through those? Because I feel like I hear guys preach with those sort of illusions. The Matrix. I've heard pastors dip into these things. I mean, it seems to me that the more popular movies, seem to counteract. I mean, Lucy's great, but nobody talks about that movie. I mean, generally, it's.
So, Star Wars, I think, promotes the notion of the possibility of alien life. Now, I love Star Wars. I grew up watching Star Wars, so I'm not hating Star Wars. But
well, and we don't even have to talk about Star Wars, because I know it looks like a fanboy here. I'm not trying to be confrontational.
I like Star Wars. But okay, so if you watch any of the Spielberg films from the 80s, right? So there's no doubt in my mind that Spielberg was working directly with the Pentagon, and that the Pentagon wanted to promote the myth of aliens.
Okay.
Now, does that mean that you can't take ET and find good, positive messages in it? Sure. But the intention that the Pentagon and perhaps Spielberg or somebody might have had is different from the intention of all the different hundreds of people that went into making the film, who were utilizing their creative potential and so forth.
Sure.
So I'm not trying to make things overly simplistic or paint
Sure.
too broad of a brush,
Sure.
but a lot of times the way this can happen is just minor tweaking of things. So, for example, you might have a film that just has a few scenes that's going to promote transgenderism.
Sure.
But maybe the overall message of the film is good. But there's a few scenes that are going to make you sympathetic to that kind of a character, because there's a strategy where money will come from big foundations, and if you put this in your movie, if you alter it, you'll get some more money.
Sure.
And so that's kind of how it works. And then over decades, what happens is people are warmed up to those kinds of things. So, for example, homosexuality, generally speaking, was considered right, and then you have Will and Grace introducing them from a perspective of it's a funny character, right? Sitcoms. So humor is oftentimes a big way that the Pentagon. But I want to add too that believe it or not, you can. There was a FOIA request done recently by a guy named Tom Secker, who does a podcast very similar to mine, and he found out that the Pentagon in the last year had donated money to Cupcake Wars and American Idol.
To what?
Cupcake
Wars?
Wars and American Idol.
Okay.
Now you think that's ridiculous, but no, the Pentagon is interested in every area of life, as would be any of the members of the establishment.
What could be the Pentagon's interest in Cupcake Wars?
Because there's a certain section of the population that's going
to... It's a war.
they want to throw cupcakes at ISIS. Because that's part of food is a huge part of culture.
Okay.
And so
I love cupcakes.
Managing and understanding culture is what the CIA does. For example, the CIA was to go into some country and they wanted to foment a revolution. Sure. What they're going to do is do what's called an ethnography. They're going to study everything about that people, even down to the way that they're going to say certain words.
Sure.
And so when you amass all that data, then you know the way by which you can change that culture. I'm trying to think of a movie where you might see this.
Colombia. Narcos, Netflix.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You talked about transhumanism, and I think there's a lot of avenues for this arc of evolution. Grime, increasing complexity to the apes that come out of the trees, and then they're touched. And I think even in atheistic culture, I believe that there's an implied sort of creation moment.
Yeah.
But what I've been seeing a lot of, and when I do research, is and I pay close attention to children's programming, is this sort of you can find real life and freedom through magic, through breaking taboos.
Yes.
Things that were arbitrarily set up by the power structure. You can become yourself, your true identity, by breaking free of that.
Right.
And that's sort of the strong, Gnostic thing where Yahweh is the false creator.
The demiurge.
The demiurge, right. And then beyond that, there's also this arc of that there's a conditioning of your humanity is soon to meet its maker. And where I think you might have heard of the show called, I think, The End of Childhood or something like that. What's it called?
You're talking about Childhood Zen, which is an Arthur C. Clarke novel. And if you read that, you're absolutely 100% on point. Clarke was actually in the circles of Aleister Crowley and was a Luciferian openly. And he thought that science and the gods, by whom he meant aliens, by whom he also means demons, were going to bring man to enlightenment. So if you watch 2001, that's what the monolith represents. It represents the next stage of evolutionary consciousness, the new aeon that the alien overlords would bring us to. So Yeah, I've totally forgot Charlie's Zen, so you're absolutely right.
Right. And so they meet these aliens, and when they finally is revealed, it's a giant, classic, red, horned, total strong demon.
Mm-hmm.
But they present him in such a way like, look, he is not ugly, he's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the same thing being pushed in that show Lucifer.
Absolutely.
He's not ugly, he's in a false position.
Right.
He's in a false position because God, your God, put him there. America's God. Yeah. And you have Wreck-It Ralph. He's not evil. He's a destroyer. Mm-hmm. He was put in the false position by the architect of this reality.
Yeah.
He's put in a false position. You have the Disney movie with Angelina Jolie as the witch and Sleeping
Maleficent.
Maleficent.
Yeah.
She's not ugly. She's not evil. She's put in a false position. And I feel like this narrative is being pushed like crazy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I was for a while dating a person who worked on Maleficent, and so she had to deal with Angelina Jolie. And Angelina Jolie is, according to this person, very much 100% a feminist, and therefore, for example, she said that she didn't want pink anywhere in the film. And so they had done a lot of CGI work and already put it in there, and they had to go back and like redo all of these scenes just because they thought, well, we're doing some fairies. But she's so feminist in her ideology that she has this war against the color pink.
Mm.
So, yes. And by the way, Angelina Jolie openly works with the CIA.
Mm.
So her handler is Melissa Melee, a former CIA operative who helped her on the film Salt. Openly, that's public mainstream news. Anyway, but yeah, and so in other words, the radical feminism that she has is actually part of that Gnostic view, right? It's the idea that all limitations or traditions are in some way bad and evil, and that the way that you can find fulfillment is to just break free from everything, which is impossible. How do you break free? I mean, this is where you would ultimately kind of get into some sort of Far Eastern thought, because individuality and who you are as a person is also a limitation. So you might as well commit suicide, right? I mean, a lot of people do, right? I mean, some people, there's people who go down this path into killing themselves. So,
on that positive note, I'm going to close. I promise to close with something positive and or funny. And so, give us a handful of imitations of some people that you think the people in this room would know.
Oh, who?
Nick Cage.
Oh, see.
Donald Trump.
Dude, Trump. Do it.
So thank you. Glad to be here. My name's Nick Cage. I've been in every film ever made. Thank you.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
I got a bunch of them. Bill Cosby. I don't actually do a good Bill Cosby, but it's funny because
Just put some pills in my drink.
Give us, let's see.
Christopher Walken.
I don't do a good Christopher Walken.
Who do you do a good one of?
My mind is potato. It's mush.
Give us a political candidate.
Winston Churchill.
No wait.
Come on, Lindsey Graham. He's pretty.
Do you guys know Rand Paul?
Yeah, dude.
Well, you know, Rand Paul's from Kentucky, and in Kentucky, we have a tradition that the gold standard's the only way to go.
That's good.
That's good. Matthew McConaughey.
I drive a Lincoln, and one thing I'm going to do is drive this Lincoln into space.
All right, let's get back to that. All right, so I'm sure you guys, if you got more questions, you can talk to Jay after we wrap up here in a second. And again, my point here was just to introduce you guys. Jay's a gift. I just want to say Jay is a gift. It's really hard to find, in my opinion, people who are willing to tackle these very difficult subjects. I think a lot of us ask these questions, and we were trying to place them together. And when you go into the alternate media and try to find people who discuss this, they don't believe in God, or they believe in aliens, or and they just go wacko.
Wacko stuff,
And so here we've got a guy who is going into those areas. He's very bright, and he's able to deal with all this amount of information. He comes at it from a Christian worldview. He understands the reality of the supernatural, God, the devil, demons, angels. This is all part of our Christian worldview that you've got to believe in to figure out all that's going on. So we're really blessed to have him, and he's only, 2 or 3 hours away. I don't know exactly where Paris, Tennessee is, but it's somewhere between Nashville and Memphis. He actually lives in Paris. I thought he lived in Franklin. But he's a gift for us, so I'm so glad that you guys got to meet a little bit tonight. I hope you guys talked to him a little bit afterwards. And this has been a great crowd. Hey, you guys paid $10. You were
Thanks
awesome.
for listening to me
You stayed for
ramble.
a long time. So, great session, and we are formally done. Informally, ask Jay questions. Thanks, buddy. Yeah, man.
The agenda for the American Century?
Yeah.
Yeah.